She was supposed to be done. That's what they said. That's what the numbers said. That's what 3 consecutive first-round exits at Roland Garros were screaming to anyone paying attention. And yet, 5 days after the most humiliating loss of her young career, Alex Eala walked into a quiet press room in Birmingham, England, sat down in front of a microphone, and said something that stopped the entire tennis world cold. Not a retirement announcement. Not an apology. Something far more dangerous than either of those things. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly what she had just survived, because what happened in Paris wasn't just a bad match. It was a public unraveling. 3 years in a row. First round, Roland Garros. The same clay courts that had launched her into the spotlight were now swallowing her whole, and the critics, the analysts, the people who had once called her the most exciting player of her generation, they weren't whispering anymore. They were loud. They were certain. And honestly, looking at the evidence, it was hard to argue with them. She was 21 years old, ranked 37 in the world, and the story of Alex Eala was starting to feel less like a rising star and more like a cautionary tale. A player who peaked too early. A player who couldn't handle the pressure of the biggest stages. A player who, when it mattered most, simply wasn't there. And then she walked into that press room in Birmingham. The journalists expected routine. Pre-tournament pleasantries. A few lines about fighting spirit and looking forward. What they got instead was something that none of them had prepared for. She sat down. She was calm. Unnervingly calm. And when the first few questions came in about the French Open loss, about her clay season, about her future, she answered each one with patience, with grace, almost with a kind of quiet that felt like the surface of a lake just before something enormous breaks through it. And then a reporter from a major British outlet asked the question, "Alex, some are saying you've plateaued. What do you say to those critics?" The room leaned in. She looked down at her hands. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds of complete silence, and then she looked up, directly into the camera, and said, "I'm not the same player who left Paris. I've learned. I've grown. And I'm ready." Now here's the thing. Athletes say things like that all the time. It's almost a cliché at this point. But something about the way she said it, something about the stillness in her voice, the absence of desperation, made it feel completely different. Made it feel like a warning. She leaned forward into the microphone and kept going, and what came out next was not the speech of someone trying to save face. It was the speech of someone who had already made peace with the fire she was about to walk into. She said the clay season was hard. But hard doesn't mean failure. Hard means growth. Hard means I know exactly what I need to fix. And then she said it, clean and direct, without flinching. "I'm not just coming to Birmingham to compete. I'm coming to win." The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a press conference, but the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand yet. She stood up, nodded once, and walked out. The press conference lasted less than 10 minutes. Within hours, the clip had been viewed 20 million times. The hashtag #IwaiReady was trending globally. And the tennis world, which had spent weeks writing her eulogy, was suddenly sitting up very straight. But here's what nobody saw. Here's what the cameras missed entirely. The next morning at 6 o'clock, before the sun had fully risen over the damp grass courts of the Edgbaston Priory Club, Alex Eala was already out there. Alone. Racket in hand. Running drills in the early morning fog while the rest of the tournament field was still asleep. Her coach stood at the baseline, feeding ball after ball, watching her footwork, correcting the angle of her approach shot, saying nothing about the clip that was going viral on every device in the world. Because this was the part that never made the highlights. This was the part that the 30 million people who watched the press conference never got to see. The grinding, unglamorous, repetitive work of someone who wasn't just talking about being ready. Someone who was building it, shot by shot, in the silence of a practice court at 6 in the morning. Later that day, she sat for a short interview with a journalist from the Philippines. And when asked what was actually different, what had actually changed, she said something that hit very differently once you understood the full picture. She said, "I used to play not to lose. Now I'm playing to win." That single sentence. That single shift. On the surface, it sounds like a motivational poster. But if you understand tennis, If you understand what it actually means to be a 21-year-old Filipino girl competing on the most elite courts in the world, away from her home, away from everything familiar, carrying the hopes of an entire nation on her shoulders, then you understand that the difference between playing not to lose and playing to win is not a small adjustment. It is a complete psychological rebirth. And something about it felt real. Something about the worn-out practice shoes she posted on Instagram that evening, with a caption about the work that happens when no cameras are rolling, felt real in a way that press conference speeches rarely do. Coco Gauff commented on that post. And not just a generic supportive comment. She said, "This right here, this is why you're different." Naomi Osaka followed. Iga Swiatek, the world number 2, posted a single word: respect. These were not courtesy likes from polite colleagues. These were recognitions from the best players on the planet that something was different about this version of Alex Eala. And then the tournament started. Her first opponent was a Czech qualifier ranked 112 in the world. On paper, a manageable draw. But on grass, on the first match of the season, on a surface where nerves can cost you everything before you've found your rhythm, nothing is guaranteed. Especially not for a player who had spent months being publicly doubted. The first game lasted less than a minute. Service winner. Done. The qualifier had studied Aya's clay court matches. She had prepared for long defensive rallies, for a player who liked to reset and wait. She was completely unprepared for what was actually standing across the net from her. A player who attacked the net like it owed her something. A player who took the ball early, redirected it with frightening precision, and looked, for the first time in a long time, completely comfortable. The set ended 6-1 in 24 minutes. The second set, 6-2. The match was over in 52 minutes. And the headlines that followed weren't just about the score. They were about the transformation. Because the journalists who had been in that press conference room, who had watched her make that announcement with fire in her eyes, were now watching it materialize on a grass court in real time. She had said she was ready, and round 1 seemed to be saying, maybe she actually was. But here's where the story gets complicated. Here's where the real test was waiting, quiet and patient, just a few days away. The semi-final. The number 2 seed. A veteran grass court specialist who had reached the Wimbledon quarterfinals twice, who had never lost to a player ranked outside the top 30 on this surface, who was, by every reasonable metric, the kind of opponent that separates the press conference speeches from the actual champions. The analysts were politely skeptical. The odds makers made her the underdog. And when Aya walked onto center court for that semi-final, the modest crowd of the early rounds had transformed into something else entirely. The Philippine flags were no longer scattered. They were a sea. Red, white, and blue, wall to wall, rippling in the Birmingham afternoon air. And the chants, Laban Alex, weren't echoing anymore. They were thundering. And what happened next was the kind of tennis that makes people forget they're watching a sport. It was like watching someone execute a plan that had been constructed in the quiet of a 6 a.m. practice session and saved every detail of it for exactly this moment. The first set was a masterclass. She broke early. She attacked the net relentlessly. She sliced and volleyed and took every ball on the rise, refusing to let the rally develop, refusing to let the veteran settle into the kind of grinding baseline exchange she was so comfortable with. The set ended 6-3 in 31 minutes. The veteran, to her enormous credit, did not fold. She raised her level in the second set. The rallies got longer. The tension in the stadium got thicker. For all, the crowd on the edge of their seats. And then a break point. And then Aya looked into the stands. And what she saw in that moment is the kind of detail that doesn't make it into the box score but defines the entire story. Her mother, Riza, in the stands, hands pressed together, head bowed, praying. A little girl named Sophia in the front row, holding up a drawing she had made of Aya, waving it with both hands, her face completely overwhelmed with hope. She looked at them. She looked back at the court. She converted the break point. And then she stepped to the baseline to serve for the match, and the stadium was so loud that the players on the adjacent courts reportedly couldn't hear their own coaches. She bounced the ball. Twice. 3 times. And then she served an ace. 15 love. Another serve, another winner. 30 love. The crowd was already rising to its feet. Another serve. Return floated long. 40 love. 3 match points. And then she tossed the ball one final time, swung through it, the serve landed just inside the line, and her opponent's return came back soft and central, sitting up in the middle of the court like an invitation. Eala stepped in, crushed a forehand into the open court. The stadium didn't just applaud. It detonated. She fell to her knees, racket raised, tears running down her face. And in the front row, her mother, who had traveled from the Philippines, who had made every sacrifice, who had sat through every loss, every criticism, every moment when the world said her daughter had peaked, was weeping. Not from sadness. From something much bigger than that. She had reached the final of the Birmingham Open. Her first grass court final in her career. Her first WTA final since Miami 2025. And she had done it by being, as she had promised in a quiet press room just days earlier, a completely different player. But here's the part that the fairy tale version of this story leaves out. Here's the part that requires you to sit with it for a moment before moving on. The final was 2 days later. The opponent, a former Wimbledon semifinalist, one of the most complete grass court players in the world. The match was everything you would want it to be. 3 sets. 2 hours. The kind of tennis that leaves you breathless and a little bit broken. And Alex Eala lost. 6-4. 3-6. 7-5. The trophy slipped through her fingers at the very last moment, in the very last game, on the most painful kind of close. And she walked off that court, the runner-up trophy in one hand, her racket bag over her shoulder, and her head held high. And the crowd, the same crowd that had come to see her win, did not sit down. They stood. They applauded. Not for the winner. For her. That night, she posted a photo on Instagram. Just her, standing on center court, the runner-up trophy beside her, the Philippine flags still waving in the background behind her. And the caption she wrote was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened in the previous 2 weeks. She wrote, "I didn't win the trophy. But I won something more important. I proved that I belong. The Eala effect is not over. It's just getting started." 12 million likes in 24 hours. Coco Gauff wrote, "Proud of you, friend. This is just the beginning." Naomi Osaka wrote, "You are a champion in every sense of the word." And then Cristiano Ronaldo, whose CR7 brand she had represented throughout the tournament, posted 3 words. Laban. Boys. And now here is the question that this entire story has been quietly building toward, the one that cuts deeper than the scores or the rankings or the viral clips or the heartbreak of the final. When the next generation of Filipino athletes stands on a world stage, when the next 21-year-old from Manila or Cebu or Davao is told by the world that they have peaked, that they are not built for this level, that the gap between where they are and where they dream of being is simply too wide, what story will they reach for? Will it be the story of someone who won a trophy? Or will it be the story of a girl who lost 3 consecutive first rounds at Roland Garros, who flew directly from that defeat to Birmingham, who walked into a press room and looked into a camera and told the world, not with desperation, not with bravado, but with terrifying calm, that she was not done, and then went out onto a grass court and proved it one shot at a time? Because the Eala effect was never actually about tennis. It was never about the rankings or the wild cards or the runner-up trophies. It was about something much harder to measure and much more important to witness. It was about what happens when someone refuses to accept the story the world is writing about them. It was about the 6 a.m. practice sessions that nobody films. The worn-out shoes. The mother praying in the stands. The little girl named Sophia holding up a drawing in the front row. And a player who, in the quietest and most powerful way possible, decided that hard does not mean over. That losing is not the end. That you don't need to win the trophy to prove that you belong. The grass season had just begun. Wimbledon was next. And Alex Eala, ranked 37 in the world and rising, was just getting started. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hit different, you already know what to do.